Thank you. Thank you all for being here. I'd like us to start with a brief clip of Attorney General Jeff Sessions announcing the reversal of the somewhat more lenient drug sentencing approach of the Obama administration.
We've empowered our prosecutors to charge and pursue the most serious offense, as I believe the law requires, most serious, readily provable offense. It means that we're going to meet our responsibility to enforce the law with judgment and fairness. It is simply the right and moral thing to do. But it is important to note that unlike previous charging memoranda, I have given our prosecutors discretion to avoid sentences that would result in an injustice. This is a key part of President Trump's promise to keep America safe. We are seeing an increase in violent crime in our cities, particularly in Baltimore, Chicago, Memphis, and Milwaukee, St. Louis, and many others. The murder rate has surged 10% nationwide, the largest increase in murder since 1968. And we know that drugs and crime go hand in hand. They just do. The facts prove that's so. Drug trafficking is an inherently dangerous and violent business. If you want to collect a drug debt, you can't file a lawsuit in court. You collect it with the barrel of a gun. In 2015, more than 52,000 Americans died from a drug overdose. That's a stunning number. According to a report by the New England Journal of Medicine, the price of heroin is down, its purity is up, and its availability is up. We intend to reverse this trend. We are returning to the enforcement of the laws as passed by Congress, plain and simple. If you are a drug trafficker, we will not look the other way. We will not be willfully blind to your misconduct. We are talking about, for example, a kilogram of heroin. That's 10,000 doses of heroin on the streets. 5 kilograms of cocaine, 10,000 kilograms of marijuana. These are not low-level drug offenders we and the federal courts are focusing on. These are drug dealers, and you drug dealers are going to prison. Working with integrity and professionalism, attorneys who implement this policy will meet the high standards required of the Department of Justice, and together we will win this fight.
Now it's seven words of that announcement in particular, the words drugs and crime go hand in hand, that inspired this session of the Dangerous Ideas series. There's something weird and strangely unreflective in Sessions' claim that drugs and crime are inextricably linked. And that's what I want to explore in my part of this panel before handing over to Dr. Fritsvold. I want to make just two preliminary points before launching into that exploration of possible meanings. Firstly, we suffer from an imprecise and regrettably loaded use of the word drug in our public discourse. Sessions doesn't define what he means by drugs. Presumably he's working on the assumption that we all know what is meant by the word, and the word is intended, I think, to conjure up in our minds the image of members of a disheveled underclass shooting up God knows what in a darkened and seedy basement. So let's aim at some greater precision. If one includes all drugs, those used for the treatment of disease as well as those used for so-called recreational purposes, then we should broadly define a drug as any substance introduced into the body which either alters normal bodily function so as to treat, cure, or prevent a disease, or else alters or augments a physical or mental state. And the aim of altering one's mental state is served by all of those substances that are psychoactive in character. A psychoactive drug being one that alters the state of consciousness of the user. We might, of course, alternatively use the term here intoxicating substances, and that is in some sense preferable, since the word drug has so many Sessions-type negative connotations associated with it. But of course, we'll here need to operate with a broad understanding of intoxication. I want to define an intoxicating substance as one that produces either excitement or stupefaction in the user. And these effects may be mild or intense, depending upon the substance and or its dose. Now, one important consequence of defining drugs like this is that the category will include many substances that Jeff Sessions is emphatically not referring to: alcohol, tobacco, caffeine, and so on. And this is just another reason why the debate about drugs is so infuriatingly riddled with cant and hypocrisy. A person, after all, may be heard condemning the use of drugs while quaffing a glass of Cabernet Sauvignon, enjoying an after-dinner cigar, or having their first much-needed cup of coffee of the morning. But this infuriates me. But we'll leave that on one side. We can always come back to that. Secondly, it's worthwhile to note the very ubiquity of intoxication in human life and culture. It's such an enormous part of the human experience. Now, one may speculate as to why this is so. There's a fascinating book by Ronald Siegel called Intoxication, which I would recommend to everybody. Siegel contends there that the use of mind-altering substances is universal throughout human history and beyond human history, animal, natural history as well. And the desire or need for intoxication functions, he thinks, like a drive, just like our drive of hunger, thirst, or sex. And he calls it a fourth drive throughout the book. He keeps referring to the fourth drive, the drive for intoxication. This is a natural part of our biology, and it creates the irrepressible demand for drugs. So the war on drugs that Sessions and many, many others talk about, however it is fought, will be entirely futile because it is a war, Siegel thinks, against our own human nature. This is one way you could proceed by thinking about why people use drugs. Another explanation for drug use, and I sort of favour this, is the Freudian one, an account that stresses the uses of intoxication in the mitigation of the difficulties of the human condition. This is a case that Freud builds up in Civilization, Its Discontents, an incredible book. And if you haven't read Civilization, Its Discontents by now, you should be bloody ashamed of yourselves and do something about that. It's an extraordinary book. Freud's claim in this book, of course, is that life is so very difficult, so impossibly difficult, full of challenges, disappointments, and impossible tasks, that nearly all of us require some means of softening its blows. And one very effective way of doing this, Freud thinks, is by taking into our bodies one or other of those substances that make us either directly experience pleasurable sensations or else make us incapable of experiencing unpleasurable sensations. It numbs us. Now, it's important in this context, I think, to note that the word narcotic itself derives from the Greek word narkotikos, which means benumbing. So the very word is for drugs and narcotics is about numbing of pain, probably. Now, the role of intoxication in the amelioration of suffering is, of course, part of the common wisdom of humankind everywhere. The message is beautifully condensed in the words of Wilhelm Busch, who said, "He who has cares also has liquor." This is a great line, of course. It's also found in a quite desperate way in the words of the British artist, late British artist, God bless him, Sebastian Horsley, who said, "People who say you shouldn't take drugs should try living inside my head for a day." Horsley was a terribly tormented person, but those kind of sentiments I don't think are alien to most of us. It seems to me, as an aside, that this anesthetic element of drug use should be compassionately factored in when lawmakers are formulating drug policy and sentencing policy. We could also, there's one other thing to say as an aside. Those comments are really about explaining drug use. Drug use is some kind of problem, the desire for intoxication, some kind of intellectual problem. But some people might not think it requires an explanation at all. One of my favorite lines from Wittgenstein is where Wittgenstein says, we can only describe and say human life is like that. And perhaps that's how it is with intoxication. It's just one of those rather basic things about human beings, part of our natural history, which doesn't require any kind of account or explanation. Well, notwithstanding all of that, drug use, or rather illicit drug use, I say illicit drug use because Jeff Sessions, I said, isn't talking about a can of Red Bull in the afternoon. That's not what he means. So he's talking about illicit drug use. This is typically seen as a bad thing, worthy of rebuke, condemnation, and punishment. The use of drugs, it's said, often causes harm to the user, while the user in turn inflicts harm on others through reckless actions, neglect of duties, and the criminal activities that appear to accompany drug use and addiction. Since these effects are clearly undesirable, society is justified in morally condemning intoxication and implementing a policy of selective prohibition, punishing those who produce, supply, and consume illicit drugs. So what might be said in response to those claims? One might, first of all, question the extent to which drug use increases crime rates. I mean, Sessions speaks very glibly about the inextricable linkage of drugs and crime, but there's not much clarity there. To shed some light on that matter, it would be useful to distinguish between different kinds of drug-related crimes. Can you throw that slide? Oh, there we go. It's like magic. This is the first and only time I've ever used anything approximating to PowerPoint, which I heartily disapprove of. So you've got these three kinds. Sorry, that's a mistake. That was my fault. It should be systemic crimes rather than systematic crimes. Systemic, economic, and psychopharmacological crimes. Systemic crimes arise because of the illegal status of drug use, one consequence of which is that drugs are bought and sold in black markets. Sessions is talking about this. Since there's no legal process by means of which disagreements regarding black market transactions can be negotiated, such disputes tend to be resolved violently. It's worth remarking here, of course, that any activity, however innocuous, will generate systemic crime if it becomes criminalized. Consider, for example, antiquarian book collecting as an example of just such an innocuous activity. Some people like old books, I'm one of them. Now, if this hobby were to be made illegal, the dealer and the collector would immediately be engaged in a criminal activity, simply by virtue of dealing in and collecting antiquarian books, thereby increasing levels of crime. One could then quite naturally say antiquarian book collecting and crime go hand in hand. Moreover, such book transactions would now need to occur in a black market setting, ushering in, for the reasons earlier said, a hike in violent conduct. In the case of systemic crimes, therefore, the connection between drugs and crime is merely contingent, arising purely from the illegal status of certain intoxicating substances. Similar observations to that may be made with regard to economic crime. This category concerns the property crimes, most commonly, of course, burglary, committed by illicit drug users and addicts in order to fund their habits. These crimes would appear to be more intimately and less contingently connected to the nature of drug use itself, since the addict wants drugs badly and will go to great lengths to get them. Again, however, this is a kind of crime that might in fact be generated by the illegality of certain drugs. Those addicted to alcohol and tobacco do not, after all, tend to fund their habits by economic crime. This is not because these licit drugs are any less addictive than illicit ones, but rather because black market prices are inflated. Decriminalization of illicit drugs might serve, I'm not saying it would, I'm saying it might serve to bring down the cost of illicit drugs, thereby reducing instances of economic crime. Now that's a point that older thinkers of the right, like Milton Friedman, William F. Buckley, used frequently to make. That's before the right lost its mind in America. Now, while both systemic and economic crime results largely, or maybe even exclusively, from the fact of prohibition, from the illegal status of drugs, psychopharmacological crime arises, it is said, from the effects of the drugs themselves. Under the influence of drugs, people who would normally behave in a responsible and law-abiding fashion commit criminal and sometimes violent acts. I think it's wise to be wary of claims of that nature. It's certainly true that a substance capable of turning good citizens into crazed and violent maniacs should be prohibited, and its use morally condemned. It's not entirely clear, however, that such substances exist. You have a vision of the kind of Jekyll and Hyde thing, of a guy taking this substance and becoming this sort of monster. And if such a thing did exist, obviously you'd want that banned, but it doesn't seem to be the case that it does. You know, and even, I mean, a great many of the drugs prohibited for recreational use, the true narcotics, for example, actually deliver soporific effects that effectively decreases the likelihood of aggressive actions. To think, moreover, that a specific piece of behavior may be entirely caused by the consumption of a particular drug is to fall victim to a belief in what Jacob Sullum colourfully calls voodoo pharmacology. So these have a kind of magical effect on the user. And it ignores the extent to which reactions to intoxicants depend upon social context and the characteristics of the individual user. Alcohol, by the way, and as we all know, can increase violent inclinations in a great many people. Very few people are calling for its criminalization. You know, there's big problems back in England from Saturday night drinking. I mean, the English are very violent and warlike people who always love a fight. And if you pour alcohol into a great many English people, they're going to start fights. And marketplaces in England, in rural towns, are terribly violent. Not because of heroin or cocaine, because of people drinking enormous amounts of alcohol in a very brief period of time. So the point about this is to say, well, if you're concerned about people consuming substances, then becoming violent and doing terrible things, then there's no reason why alcohol doesn't fall within the remit of this discussion. Commonly, it doesn't, of course. Anyway, even if drugs do not bear such a clear relation to crime as commonly thought, and as thought by Jeff Sessions, the use of intoxicating substances might still have a detrimental effect on society, and it's this that perhaps might justify their prohibition. This is a point that was always made by James Q. Wilson, who was the chairman of the American National Advisory Council for Drug Abuse Prevention back in the 70s, I think. Wilson contended that drug use produces, and I quote, individuals who regularly victimize their children by neglect, their spouses by improvidence, their employers by lethargy, and their co-workers by carelessness. So the fruits of drug use for Wilson are neglect, improvidence, lethargy at work. See a bit of that from time to time around here, and carelessness among co-workers. Likewise, a report produced by the American Office of National Drug Control Policy declared that drugs erode the user's sense of personal responsibility, diminishing an individual's capacity to operate effectively as a student, a parent, a spouse, and an employee. So all these things are highlighting the effect of drugs on your performance in school and the workplace as a family member. Now, while it's true that the use of drugs may produce these undesirable results in some, or even many people, such effects are not universal, nor may drugs uniquely be responsible for their appearance. Take the case of alcohol again. The use of alcohol can lead to an individual being neglectful and improvident. But this is not the case for all people who consume it, even on a regular basis. And this should give a person pause before making blanket statements about the consequences of intoxicant utilization. An individual, moreover, may be a poor-performing student, a lethargic employee, or a bad spouse without ever having used any intoxicants at all, legal or illegal. And these two observations are combined in Michael Humer's argument for the decriminalization of drugs. Humer contends that it's not illegal to be lethargic at school or work. It's not illegal to be a poor-performing student. Thank God. I won't continue that thought. It's not illegal to be a bad co-worker.
Should be.
Yeah. It's not illegal to be a careless spouse. So it must be unacceptable, Humer says, for a person to face criminal charges for doing something that only has a chance of indirectly bringing about something which is not in itself illegal. This is a great argument. I mean, I really recommend reading Michael Humer's work on this. It's very clear, and it really cuts through a lot of the nonsense in the debate. At this stage, one might retreat to a less contentious and more demonstrable matter, namely the harms caused by intoxicants to users themselves. Now, these are often exaggerated, but they're real enough. We don't need a full inventory here, but we can note the damage to lungs and throat caused by tobacco, the cirrhosis produced by heavy alcohol consumption, brain cell loss resulting from the use of methamphetamines, as well as the psychological and relational problems that may flow from at least excessive drug use. Now, such dangers should constitute enough of a reason to advise individuals against the use of intoxicants. But it should be emphasized that that would be a prudential piece of advice rather than a moral command. And it certainly shouldn't form the basis of any criminal punishment. Indeed, for me, it's hard to see why a person should be morally condemned or punished by the law for pursuing a state of intoxication. Just a state where pleasurable sensations are sought and unpleasurable ones reduced. Now, evidently, an individual in a state such as that should not undertake any task in which others are put at risk, driving a car, for example, nor should a person be improvident or negligent in their reasonable duties towards relevant others. But if the harms flowing from an individual's actions affect no person other than that individual, it's hard to see why a moral judgment should be made at all. It's certainly not why that individual should be punished. Moral judgments and legal penalties should probably extend only to those persons whose actions have harmed others against their will. This, of course, is the classic view taken by John Stuart Mill in On Liberty. Now, the pursuit of intoxication does not in itself fall into the category of condemnable actions. There seems to be nothing wrong, therefore, in seeking intoxication, though one should be aware of the potential risks of pursuing pleasure along those lines. But again, that's only a piece of prudential advice. It's not a basis for coercion. It is, in fact, rather peculiar that drugs should be singled out as particularly worthy of moral criticism because of the damage they cause to the user, him or herself. There are a great many activities. You can list them yourselves. Here's a few: sunbathing, mountain climbing, many sports, which carry a large degree of risk but are rarely subject to moral criticism and legal prohibition. I mean, few people would think that a young man, for example, devoting his life to playing football is acting in a morally questionable way, even though he risks inflicting significant harms on himself as a result of that. Now, we can think about why that is. One reason, presumably, is that society places a high value on these other activities. sports in particular, though why that should be so is not obvious. But society can detect little worth in intoxication, particularly of the illicit kind. But even then, it's hard to see what the great social value of sunbathing is, or of the excessive consumption of high cholesterol foods, or of terribly sugary drinks. Well, why aren't these banned if we're concerned about protecting people from themselves? And to return to an earlier point, why on earth isn't alcohol illegal? The damage caused by alcohol is tremendous, but this is under the radar of what Sessions is talking about. Now, obviously, a great deal of theoretical groundwork is required to pursue these questions in deeper detail. There's groundwork, for example, relating to the rival merits of paternalism and libertarianism as the proper outlook of government and the state. My more limited goal here has simply been to think about what it means to say that drugs and crime go hand in hand. And I don't think I have any clear idea at all of what that means whatsoever. Hopefully, you can give us some enlightenment on that.
Enlightenment is a strong way to be introduced. I get to start by thanking everybody for coming, by thanking Dr. Clack and the Humanities Center for having me. I deeply appreciate the interdisciplinary mission of the Humanities Center, and as the resident criminologist, will try to do my job of bringing data and data and data to complement a philosophical argument as best I can. Two philosophers in the room. I wanted to talk a bit about Kantian proportionality, but I'm a little scared, so we'll see if I can ramp up to that. So the social constructs, so in my limited time here, start at the global level. We'll look at some global data about drug markets and drug trafficking. We'll look at national data, the impact of drugs on the correctional system, and we'll talk about a few policy issues that we should be particularly aware of here in California. And I'll try to wrap that all into a somewhat direct response to Jeff Sessions' assertion about crime and drugs going hand in hand. Drugs as a social construct might be the predominant theme for this talk, and the artificial value of drugs, right? There's nothing inherently, with a few exceptions of very high-end club drugs, there's nothing inherently expensive about drugs. I would argue there are inherently expensive things about your iPhone or automotive technology, but there's no real manufacturing reason that drugs should be expensive. So to put that into context, in 2005, the then director of the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime said that this is not a small enemy against which we struggle, it is a monster. And he went on to cite international drug trafficking data to support that claim. The international drug trafficking business is somewhere in the neighborhood of a $400 billion annual business, $400 billion. The United States has the largest share of that market, and then we have the world's largest cocaine market. Western Europe is making a comeback as the strong number 2 with increased use of ecstasy over the last decade. That 400 billion number roughly approximates the entire GDP of my homeland of Norway. If drug trafficking was an independent sovereign nation, it would have the 21st largest economy in the world, and as of today, the international market for illegal drugs is bigger than that of tobacco, wine, beer, chocolate, coffee, and tea combined. Still smaller than the wholesale market for oil. So it is absolutely not a small challenge. Here in America, ramping up in roughly 1971, the Nixon administration was probably the first to use the term war on drugs, and thereafter had a very significant impact on shaping our modern correctional system. So as the many correction students here in the room know, America now has roughly 5% of the world's general population, but we have 25% of the world's incarcerated population. So 1 in 4 people incarcerated in the globe is incarcerated here in America. That's a byproduct of many things. It's a byproduct of crime rates. It's a byproduct of policy choices. It's a byproduct of our country's ability to do incarceration on this scale. There are many other countries that have higher crime rates, but they don't have the infrastructure to do incarceration like we do here. And we'll get to the drug-specific data here in a minute, but we currently have about 2.1 million people incarcerated. We have the largest jail and prison system in the world. We also have the highest per capita incarceration rate of any country in the world. That 2.1 million can be a little abstract. That's roughly the entire population of Houston, Texas. If you were just to lock up everyone in Houston, that'd be roughly the size of our current jail and prison population. That 2.1 million is the same as if you took every American soldier killed in battle in our country's history and multiplied it by 3. It's a big, big, big number. Roughly a half decade ago, out of every 100 American adults, 1 was incarcerated. We almost incarcerated 1% of our population. This is a fairly unprecedented experiment, especially in a Western democracy. The term mass incarceration is one that's now being talked about in contemporary political discourse, probably in an unprecedented way. So and there's massive human, social, and economic costs to those numbers. Correction student, what does it take to incarcerate 1 California state prison inmate for 1 year? That is the right answer. So we're sending every California state prison inmate to USD, full tuition price, good meal plan. Maybe they have a place across the street with a pool. It's about 3 middle-class families here in California, their entire tax burden for 1 California state prison inmate for 1 year. So the role of drugs in those figures is fairly unprecedented. So we know those 2.1 million, about 25% are currently incarcerated where their primary crime was a drug crime. It's about 525,000 people. The annual taxpayer burden of just incarcerating drug offenders is approaching $19 billion this year. So thinking about the drugs and crime question, a little history is that, again, the take-home message from the piece, as I understood it, was that drugs are a social construct, and that line between legality and illegality was more of a patchwork, haphazard construction than it was a group of doctors and philosophers and policymakers and law enforcement coming together to have a clear, rational sequencing. So we know in the 1880s, many of the drugs that are illegal today were not only legal, but available over the counter. So yes, Coca-Cola at one point in the late 1800s did have trace amounts of cocaine in it, replaced reluctantly with my favorite drug, caffeine. So thanks for that. We know that heroin was available over the counter, and major pharmaceutical companies like Bayer used to make heroin and heroin-related products. Sold as a cure for everything from insomnia to hay fever to discomfort with monthly menstrual cycle. Apparently heroin has a wide variety of medical purposes that aren't talked about today. So fast forward to the modern era, and Dr. Clack talked a lot about harm. We know that tobacco's legal, and there are roughly 440,000 annual deaths attributable to the pharmacological impacts of tobacco. 440,000. Many experts believe that's a leading cause, a preventable cause of death in the United States. 440,000. Some people believe we can save Social Security by getting people to smoke more. Too much? Not the mission of the center. We know a little morbid joke there. We know all illegal drugs combined this year has the highest total, or 2016 had the highest total of many, about 65,000 annual pharmacological deaths from illegal drugs combined. That pales in comparison to that of tobacco. We know that of everybody going into San Diego County jails, the #1 drug correlated with violent crime is alcohol. Trying to take 2 entire semester classes and put them into a 25-minute talk. I think I'm off to a good start. All right, we'll transition to some Kantian proportionality. The systemic model for violent crime was one of the empirical evaluations that I know. 1988 looked at crack cocaine markets in New York City, and they looked at 414 different individual homicides. They got the police reports from a haphazard sample of police precincts in New York City, again, 1988, and looked at murders associated with crack cocaine. And they found that actually a small percentage of those murders were produced by the pharmacological impact of the drug itself. It wasn't zero, but it was a comparatively small amount. Surprisingly, they found that a lot of those homicides weren't the byproduct of economic compulsive related behavior. It was a pretty small chunk. They found that 74% of all homicides, granted it's one city in 1 year, and it's a haphazard sample of police precincts within that city, so it has some dubious methodology written all over it, but 75% of drug-related murders, crack cocaine market-related murders, were a byproduct of the systemic underground market for the drug, not the pharmacological impact of the drug itself. Now, clearly those don't exist in a vacuum. They're not mutually exclusive. But 3/4 of the murders were a byproduct of the criminalized underground market for drugs. And we do know that most drug markets function in a nonviolent way. They probably exist in private residences and private spaces. Policing expert Peter Moskos called it the silent majority of the American drug trade, that most drugs are sold peacefully behind closed doors. So speaking of crack cocaine in the late 1980s, I couldn't do a session about drugs and crime without talking about proportionality. And starting in the late 1970s through the 80s and into the 90s, there was very little party divide in terms of drug policy. That both parties were largely on board for a punitive criminal justice system-centric approach to drugs. And maybe some of the discourse was different and it was framed in a different way, but largely punitive drug policies had bipartisan support. And in part that resulted in what many experts believe are some of the most punitive drug laws in the history of any Western democracy. Those are the New York Rockefeller drug laws of 1986 and 1988 that put in mandatory minimum sentences for a series of types of drug crime. And what's interesting is that mandatory minimum sentences have shaped the correctional system in such a way that certain types of homicide and certain types of sexual assault, folks convicted of those felonies will end up serving less time than someone convicted of a moderate level drug offense in the federal system. And here's your Kantian proportionality argument, that even if you make the argument that dealing drugs is very, very bad, it's hard to make the argument that it's worse than murder and worse than sexual assault. So the New York Rockefeller drug laws created a rubric-based system, a mandatory minimum rubric-based system for how different drugs were going to be punished. And probably the most dubious of those laws that was scaled back in 2010, but reshaped some cities in California, reshaped cities in New York, were the mandatory minimums for crack and powder cocaine. So we know that crack cocaine and powder cocaine have the same active ingredient. They're different forms of cocaine. I don't know if a pint of beer to a glass of wine to a shot of tequila is an appropriate comparison, right? They all have the same active ingredient. They're packaged and delivered in different ways. So a little bit of a backstory. As many of you already know, simply to make crack cocaine, you just take powder cocaine and cook it with water and baking soda on a stovetop or in a microwave, depending on how much you want to make on a given day. So it's, in practice, the same thing. You can use less cocaine to make crack because then you can smoke it. So it has a more powerful way of ingesting it, therefore you can use less, and you can have a more intoxicating but shorter experience. So in part because of some violent, visible crack cocaine markets in the 1980s in some parts of some cities, the New York Rockefeller drug laws imposed these mandatory minimum sentences. For crack cocaine, one of the thresholds was 5 grams, and there's a great book that I'd recommend, appropriately titled 5 Grams, written by a friend and colleague of mine, about how these drug laws reshaped New York City and the underground hip-hop movement in New York at that time in particular. 5 grams of crack cocaine, which is roughly the size of your thumbnail, maybe a sugar packet. It's between 10 to 25 doses. So it's hard to say that that's personal use, like that's a lot of personal use, but it's like you and your buddies for a weekend kind of use, right? It's not drug trafficking, it's 10 to 25 doses. Those 10 to 25 doses of crack, if you were caught in possession of it, triggered a 5-year federal mandatory minimum sentence. In places like New York, that crack cocaine costs you on the street between $125 and $750. $125 to $750 of crack led the state to spend somewhere in the neighborhood of $350,000 incarcerating that person for 5 years in a federal prison. $300,000, $350,000 punishment for $500 of drugs. Pretty unprecedented discussion. Comparably, there were also mandatory minimum sentences put into place for powder cocaine. And interestingly, that powder cocaine threshold to trigger that 5-year federal mandatory minimum sentence was 500 grams, 100 times more, of the same thing. 100 times more. Those 500 grams of powder, I spit a little bit, I'm glad that's not on tape. Those 500 grams of powder cocaine cost between $32,000 and $50,000. So you had the same drug in different packaging, one used predominantly by people who could afford it, the other used predominantly by people who could only afford the very cheap version of that same thing. That we were punishing people for $500 of drugs, the same we were punishing people for $50,000 of the same thing, would not meet the Kantian proportionality standard. How was that for some meek language? Was scaled back in the Obama administration in 2010 through something called the Fair Sentencing Act, which people in my discipline have called the Less Unfair Sentencing Act, because there was still a pretty big disconnect between the two sentences, but the gap was smaller than it once was. So on the drugs and crime relationship, the criminological literature, as I understand it, shows a murky, non-linear, non-sequential relationship between the two. Clearly, drugs and crime going hand in hand is true in many senses. Drug possession is often a crime. Drug use is often a crime. But to Dr. Clack's point that we can criminalize and decriminalize any behavior, like we could reduce crime rates dramatically in America by making a lot of felonies non-criminal. So it depends on the public policy regime in place. But my job here is to bring the data. So again, the data suggests that drugs and crime exist in this murky, non-causal, non-linear relationship. Experts in my field haven't been able to flush out strict causality, strict sequencing, really of any kind. But here's a little data for you. 2016, hot off the presses data, because I did my homework for this event. 2016 San Diego County data sent to me by a police chief in this very county. Of everyone arrested in San Diego County last year, 75% of adults tested positive for illegal drugs. 75%. This was our highest year since the year 2000. 2016, what's interesting, meth use has largely gone down nationwide. We don't know if that's a byproduct of public education campaigns. We don't know if that's a cyclical thing. We do know that there's less meth use nationwide now than there has been in the past. For whatever reason, San Diego has been resistant to this trend. Like, we've held on to like our meth roots in a really, really strong way. I have it on good authority. In 2000 on El Cajon Boulevard, you could buy 55-gallon drums of P2P, what you use, right? It's the Breaking Bad thing that they stole to make meth. Wasn't illegal, and you could buy it for cash. They didn't even write your name down. So we have a long, dedicated history to methamphetamines. I'm glad to see that this lineage continues. Looking at arrest data in 2016, 55% of men arrested in San Diego County tested positive for meth in 2016. 55%. Ladies, good for you. I'm proud of you. 58% for y'all, so good job. Keep it up. You can do anything a man can do. You can do meth in higher rates and be arrested for it as well. So great job. But thinking about the clustering of drugs with other social problems, problem behavior theory suggests that drug use doesn't necessarily cause other things, but there tends to be a correlation between sustained use of heavily intoxicating substances, alcohol as well, and other social problems. So just looking at arrestee data. You just saw the meth numbers, which was the big hitter I should have saved for last. 65% of those arrested in San Diego County last year had been homeless. 65%. Some local agencies are spending 20% of their resources in a calendar year doing their very best to deal with the homeless population. 60% of arrestees currently unemployed. 33% have a diagnosed mental health issue. And back to my $400 billion drug trafficking issue. One day last week, single day last week, California-Mexico border, Border Patrol seized 250 pounds of drugs on one day worth $2 million. One day last week, 250 pounds. So thinking about policy, to try to dovetail with your policy suggestions, the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime suggests that the first thing we need to do to have a rational approach to drugs is to disaggregate drug users from drug criminals. That's their language, not mine. The United Nations says that drug users are folks with a public health problem that should be dealt with a public health response. That there's little value in incarcerating people who have a pretty clear need for drug treatment. We know that recidivism rates, the second highest category of any type of recidivism is for drug crime. Drug criminals, according to the UN, are major drug traffickers and folks who are profiting on others in the underground criminal marketplace. And the United Nations suggests we should disaggregate and punish those two groups differently. What does the literature show can be effective? Cornerstone 1994 RAND study says that we as a society get a 7-to-1 return if we invest in drug rehabilitation as opposed to strict incarceration for drug offenders. That's nearly a consensus in my discipline. It's interesting, nearly a consensus among law enforcement professionals as well. The question is, how do you get there? One side argues that things like drug courts and alternative sentences and alternative protocols, like Seattle has the Law Enforcement Assistant Diversion Program that's showing some really good results, should be the norm for drug offenders nationwide. Others argue we need to use the threat of heavy punishments to leverage drug offenders into treatment. But interestingly, both sides of that argument essentially want the same outcome. They just have different vehicles of getting that outcome. The literature also looks at tobacco education, and for whatever reason, a lot of the evaluation studies show that public education surrounding tobacco has been really, really effective in America. Unfortunately, public education surrounding illegal drugs has not been particularly effective. Some policy evaluations of DARE show, how many people in the room had DARE or some equivalent? Okay. Some of the longitudinal studies show that compared to the control group, that DARE participants had roughly the same rates of illegal drug use. Interestingly, a small artery of that research says DARE participants had higher rates of drug use than a control group. But if we look to public health campaigns surrounding tobacco, I think there's an important lesson there, that prevention and treatment can have a meaningful effect, that it's good for people and that it's good for society, and maybe with illegal drugs we should look to the pretty big success we had as a country and that we had here in the state of California in particular when it comes to tobacco-related harms. A good percentage of that literature talks about a reality-based or a safety-first approach to drug education. And many experts look at DARE in particular or abstinence-only approaches to drug education as not being as effective as many proponents had hoped, and that honest harm reduction or safety-first best education modalities probably show the most promise, at least my read on the literature. So drugs are ultimately a social construct. If in 1880 we could all go to the store and buy heroin, that might be the quintessential example that laws are ultimately made by people, they changed over time, and they exist in a powerful social and historical context. Laws aren't some majestic list of do's and don'ts that just exist, but rather they're things, again, created by human beings that adapt to the context in which they're created. So drugs are a social construct, I think, is my big conclusion.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. And we've got about 25 minutes or half an hour for questions. If anyone wants to make some points, we'd be happy to hear your, not just questions, we'd be happy to hear your reflections on things.
Yes, sir.
Drug addiction. These drugs, by nature, addictive. How would you propose dealing with that? In other words, the person can't stop taking the drugs due to the very nature of what it does to their minds and whatever.
I mean, I would argue probably drug addiction is one of the bigger challenges facing the correctional system in particular. These are facilities that often have people with a clear drug treatment need but don't have the resources to deliver it. What does the treatment literature say to me? It says that effective drug addiction protocols have to allow for multiple failures. That programs, drug courts or drug diversion programs that only allow one mistake or one positive drug test seem not to be particularly effective. Some experts say we need to allow as many as 7 failures or 7 returns to bad behavior before someone gets kicked out of any given program. I think how to prevent and treat drug addiction is probably largely a medical question that, I mean, I can look at the corrections literature. That's what it says to me. I think it's largely a medical question.
Well, I mean, the only point I'd add to that is I think this is a public health issue rather than an issue of criminality. I mean, addiction isn't just about the drugs that Jeff Sessions is talking about. You know, we've gone through tobacco is massively addictive, alcohol is massively addictive. I mean, I've been told by my doctor I've got to stop eating so many carbs. That's difficult for me to get off. I mean, there's a whole host of things that have an addictive and habit-forming nature. When we talk about drugs, or when I'd say we, I mean when the Attorney General and many others talk about drugs, they're thinking about something, just what puzzles me is there's sort of arbitrary boundaries around the category of drugs. And if you bring in issues of addiction, that only just serves to heighten the arbitrariness of it, because there are a whole host of things that are equally addictive without being illegal. So if it was a mark of, to be an illegal substance, we should show it's very addictive, and I've heard that argument made on a number of occasions. Well, there's a lot of things that are going to be swept up, and there's going to be a lot more people in prison for a few croissants every morning.
Can I just make a comment about the issue of addiction, which I find interesting? You may both know more about this than I do, but many of us who are older than most of the people in this room know that soldiers in Vietnam used heroin basically at 100% rate, right? I mean, the heroin use was massive. But only 10% of them continue to use heroin when they return to the United States. And there's a researcher at the University of Michigan who kind of wanted to figure out why. And so he got mice, as one does, and provided them with unlimited amounts of heroin, so as to habituate them to its use. And he sort of built a mouse Disneyland, like the place you'd want to live if you were a mouse. I did not intend that pun.
That was really well done.
Hellhole.
Right.
So the mice in Disneyland had complete access, but they had like important mice social lives, they had sexual partners, they had all the things
Right.
they wanted, and they didn't use it. The hellhole mice were just like hitting it. So one thing that I think is an important part of the discussion is addiction isn't just about a dose-brain relationship. It's about the larger social environment and supports one has, so that you might use cocaine in your 20s, and then you get a job and you need to like get up and then you stop, right? That was not a biography, it was just an observation that those kinds of things happen. But reflections on that, maybe too long comment, if you have it.
Probably one of the biggest unknowns on the criminology side of that discussion are what are sometimes referred to as functioning addicts, or people who have who use pharmacologically severe illegal drugs on a somewhat regular basis and are able to maintain regular lives. So we don't know who they are and we can't count them and we can't study them. There's also a huge population of folks who use pharmacologically severe, often addicting drugs and who desist naturally without treatment. And I'm answering a question with a question. Those are just two huge populations we don't know a lot about. We do know that social structural marginality, we know that housing matters, we know that nutrition matters, we know that context matters. The classic argument is 3 drinks at a party versus those same 3 drinks at a funeral, right? And to say that the context doesn't shape that pharmacological experience, I think is a misplaced argument. In my drugs and society class, I encourage all students to go home and do the following experiment. And I reveal what a loser I am, because I do this on a pretty regular basis, which is sometimes I come home from a long, hard day at work, I sit down with my family to have dinner, and in a wine glass, I'll make a Trader Joe's emergency vitamin C drink, right? That's how I'm living, right? And the connotation of that glass of wine, and maybe it facilitates relaxation or it signifies the end of your day, right? I encourage my students to engage in this experiment to have a non-alcoholic beverage at a moment where you regularly might have an alcoholic beverage, and then come back the next day and argue to me that context doesn't matter. So of course context matters, and of course addiction is shaped by massive social structural factors. It's a little tangential to my area of expertise, but the addiction question is clearly one that is shaped by social structures.
I mean, just to add to that, on your point, one of the things I do like, one of the many things I do like about Freud's approach to this is to link heavy intoxication to varying levels of human misery. And there's a number of things that need to be in place for us to get through it all, and rewarding career, satisfying life at home, love, possibly some kind of religious perspective. And as he says, if all those things fall through, people find themselves taking refuge in a life of chronic intoxication. Well, this seems to be, I mean, he's always criticised as being someone who doesn't have his eye on empirical data, but this seems to at least be closely allied with the things that you said about the mice. Happy mice don't get high. They don't need to. They're happy themselves, you know? Happy mice don't get high, yeah.
I was working on a mouse Disneyland joke that whole time and just had nothing, right? But I was actively working on it and I fell short, Dr. Clack.
I mean, as an idea, intoxication is a strange, strange thing. Just to think about it, just to step back from what it means. I used to live on the edge of the Gaslamp Quarter, as you know. And on Friday and Saturday nights, I just see these lines of cars carrying people to pour themselves into these bars for hours, knocking back Jack and Coke and Miller High Life or whatever it is that people want, and then being poured out of these bars. It's a weird thing to want to change your state of mind. And this is the Freudian point, and it's not just a Freudian point, it's a Schopenhauerian point. Pascal makes this point. If you were genuinely happy, you wouldn't want to change your state of consciousness. The desire to change your state of consciousness, and in many ways block it out completely, as is suggested, recommended in the book of Proverbs, in the Bible, bizarrely, which is if you're miserable, give wine to him who is heavy of heart and make him forget his troubles. There's a reason why we drink. There's a reason why you go home at the end of the day, and first thing I do is to pour myself a drink. That's because you want to unwind. But if there's something which is unpleasant up here that requires some kind of amelioration, or as Freud calls it, palliation. And I think this is what's not factored in what Jeff Sessions and all the drug warriors are going on about. It's just people. Why would these people possibly do this, other than being evil people? It's not that. It's somehow connected with the conditions of society, the dissatisfaction that the person experiences in their lives, and maybe in the human condition itself, but that's, of course, a very broad thing.
In addition to the addiction, you've got these debts. I don't know how you can reconcile legalizing the use of drugs, addictive drugs, when, let's say, it's only 10% of all the people that use it become, where they can't stop using it, and then you've got 50,000 people, and more than half, by the way, are dying using pharmacy drugs,
Right.
which is another issue.
Yeah.
I don't see how you can legalize the use of addictive drugs without some sort of controls or saying, okay, the people that are addicted, we won't criminalize, and we'll criminalize the dealers. And I have no problem with that, but it seems to me you can't just say, well, this really isn't a problem, so we don't have to do anything.
Do you want to comment on that one?
You want to go first?
Well, no, I think I'd retreat to my earlier thoughts about how the problems we've got with making any addictive substance illegal. But then again, I'd say this is to be treated as a health issue, and again, not to do with criminalising people for taking a substance into their body. That seems to be an odd thing, to be criminalised for taking a substance into your own body. If there's one thing I've got control over and should have freedom over purely, it's what's within this 6-foot space.
How do you think decriminalization of certain illegal drugs could impact, or not impact, the ability to foster greater programs for rehabilitation of those drugs?
That's yours.
Okay. We're going to find out soon in this state is the answer to that question. And that in California, there might be no more important time to be looking at these issues in the last 40 years than right here, right now in the state of California in 2017. Proposition 47, as you know, is 3 years old, taking a lot of felonies, many of them drug felonies, pushing them to misdemeanors, taking a lot of those misdemeanors and making them infractions. So we are decriminalizing drugs in some senses. Clearly, California, like several other states, have legalized recreational marijuana markets. What that's going to mean for the underground market, what that's going to mean, there's just some emerging data coming out of Colorado. Those are great questions. Empirically, it's hard to point to trends for any reasonably grounded answer that's not speculation at this point. The state of California is gonna find out. And there are a host of implementation issues with Prop 47 that, of course, we would need to talk through. But then I would be boring this audience to death, even though it's an important conversation about the nuts and bolts of implementation. But the short answer is we're going to find out in the next 5 years.
Mike.
I'm just kind of curious, some of the conversation reminds me of some, I don't know this literature or this field well at all, but it reminds me of this stuff that Foucault talks about in Madness and Civilization and discipline and punishment. He says, like, look, like, the beginning of incarceration is largely like a rounding up of indigent kind of folks who are basically malingerers, and because they're behaving in this way, they're not contributing to the economy. So then you lock them up. And if you have private prisons, for example, then you turn out to be able to like make money off people who aren't contributing any money. And so I'm kind of curious about like what the statistics are with respect to the types of persons who are being arrested and their employment levels, and how this kind of factors into the idea that perhaps like what's most dangerous about some of this is the fact that it's the kind of economizing of human beings.
Interesting.
Sure. So that's a question I'd like to unpack over the course of a semester-long class, or maybe several. I'll try to hit on some of the main points. We know nationwide about 8% of all prisoners are held in private for-profit prisons. Largely that's Corrections Corporation of America and the GEO Group, formerly Wackenhut. They tend to be used in disproportionately more rural states, or states that maybe have, thank you, I was trying to do the thing, less infrastructure. So you see New Mexico uses private prisons a lot, Hawaii uses private prisons a lot, Alaska does as well. there's the critical mass of folks in my field are pretty against private prisons, often in a very extreme way. There's very little data to suggest that there's a meaningful impact on recidivism rates, that there's a dramatic increase in programming available. The data seems to show they basically function roughly the same as state-based prisons, and there isn't a huge cost savings because many private prisons cap medical costs and mitigate their risk by writing the contract to pass that tax burden back to us. So,
Well, just one of the things.
Sure.
So I think, like, part of what interests me is that, like, we hear statistics about the expense that it costs to kind of like keep a prisoner in a state or federal penitentiary.
Right.
And those costs, I just kind of wonder if those costs work in ways that are kind of like, you know, departments changing budgets, right? So it costs my department this much money and we take it out of that department's line. But it really is just an exchange of funds within institutions. And so I'm kind of wondering if states and federal penitentiaries actually end up, you know, really kind of generating revenue, even if the statistical report is such that it costs that much money to have a prisoner, as to whether or not like this actually is like an economic generation.
Sure. This is your, that's a great question. That's the prison industrial complex question. And so the answer is, of course, it's complicated. That there are clearly some entities that benefit from incarceration economically. Those entities, often phone companies, construction companies, and some associations and unions for correctional officers in particular. Those seem to be your big economic winners. From a state position, my understanding is the benefits for a political actor or for a municipality are probably more on the artificial benefit of a tough on crime discourse that historically the American public has supported via the ballot box. But the economics tend to be particularly high for for-profit companies that exist tangential to prisons. When a prison comes to a town, like we see the prison belt in California, like central California, right off the 99 has how many prisons, that there is some benefit to the municipality for tax and poverty funding. So that prisoner is counted as a resident of Taft, California, while they're a member of the prison, as opposed to a resident of the community where their crime took place or where they were raised. So in cities like New York, you're taking disproportionately people from the city and reallocating the tax funds that were supposed to support them to these very small rural communities up near the Canadian border that have 65% of their town's population is in the prison, and they have a funding boon. So the private contractors win, tax money wins. I think I answered your question.
Yeah, no, that's really, like,
And so they have like great high schools, right, as a result. Thank you.
All of them.
Yeah, so I was a little late. I was a while late.
All the good stuff happened at the beginning. No.
I was wondering what the like ideological reasons are between the drugs and the freedom part, because I think you may have mentioned it right at the end, but I'm sure I missed a lot of it at the beginning. Where does government and external bodies find the right, or where do they start thinking that they have the right to control what goes in one's body? Because even though drugs are like addictive or whatever, it's still the person willingly, as long as you're a consensual age, like 18 or whatever the standardized accepted consensual age is for that. As long as they're of age and of sound mind, where's the problem?
Well, this is what I was hinting at the end about. We've got political philosophers in the room who can spell this out more than I can. But there's the distinction between, broadly, views that say the government has a paternalistic role, and people with a more libertarian persuasion who think the government should not have any say over what people do to themselves, if they don't inflict harms on others. And as I said, this is what John Stuart Mill's ideal on liberty is. And there's a great popular support, at least in principle, for that view among libertarian leaning people in this country. I'm personally not sympathetic to the libertarian project in general, which I think is often just a subterfuge for the rich to get even more stuff for themselves. But on this view, with regard to one's own personal conduct, without any harms being inflicted on other people, so as far as this extends to sexual matters, say, or to the use of intoxicants, I think it's very hard to isolate why it is that the government or the state should have any say over that matter. And I was trying to work out what it was that Jeff Sessions thought, but I'm not entirely sure how that can be substantiated, other than you just take a completely paternalistic view of people's behaviour and say, I know what's better for you than you do. But then you've got to extend it to all sorts of things which people don't like again, playing football. I don't know why drugs are pulled out as the one thing. I mean, there's other things. I mean, speed limits, I suppose.
Do you want to have a taxi driver in the taxi cab you're driving, either be?
No, I don't. I don't want him to. I don't want him to be drunk either. I don't want him to be drunk. Again, the addiction and the deaths that result from drug use has to be regulated. Yeah. Okay.
Just say, okay, everybody do drugs because.
I'm not saying that. No, I'm not saying that because first of all, the position that Mill adopts is not about that. He's going to condemn drunk driving as much as anyone would, because it's that then impacts upon other people's well-being. But what my question to you is, how do you say I don't want a taxi driver who's using meth? I don't want a taxi driver who's using meth, but I don't want a taxi driver who's just had a bottle of Sauvignon Blanc either. But one of those seems, we like Sauvignon Blanc. And if I tell you, if I come into work and I speak to Sarah and say, I have a wonderful bottle of Sauvignon Blanc, I drank it all by myself, we can talk about, but if I come and say, I was off my face on meth last night, then there's going to be a different, but there's...
You'd be a dean of a prominent medical school.
But you see the point, I'm concerned about the level that when we talk about drugs, we don't mean other damaging substances. The rates of drunk driving in this country are astonishing. I mean, you probably know the statistics on that, but I'd be happy to bet that more people die as a result of drivers using alcohol than using currently illegal substances.
And I'd love to jump in if you
Yeah,
don't mind.
please.
I mean, I don't want any of the data that, I'm absolutely not an advocate for drug legalization. I think many of the arguments presented could be as much an argument for alcohol criminalization. It's the social construct nature of the wine meth disconnect that I think is the heart of the talk, and I've been seeing this gentleman's hand most of the time.
Definitely. So I'd like to say initially that processed food and meat kills more people than any of these things could hope to. So if you really want to look at like death numbers, processed meat and processed food in general kill way more. But besides that, I get that neither of you is like a historian or an economist, but I think that it's interesting if you look at just like the historical implications of when these things became illegal and like the shift in the economy. Sure. If you're talking about America's history or the history of the West, it's like economically determinative. So it doesn't make sense to talk about these social or like philosophical things without talking about like the economic implications of these things.
Sure.
And so like when you reference that prior to 1880, all these drugs were like openly available. Prior to 1880, most people had their own jobs and businesses. They didn't like work for other people. That shift happens like later on. So they need to be like on time to work, good at your job. All these kinds of things become like more important. So while it's not illegal to like actually be lazy or any of these things, it is like socially like unacceptable, and it's also economically bad for productivity. And as a country, of course they're going to tell you what you can and cannot do when it comes to productivity, because all the country has is its labor, is its people. You know what I'm saying? So if you're not like a good labor force, then I'm going to make you a good labor force with laws and statutes. And so I think it's like, I think that has to be introduced into like all these things. I mean, even like the crack versus like cocaine thing, when you put water and baking soda into this thing, all you're doing is increasing the volume, so you can have more for less.
That's right.
It's poor. You're poor, basically. And so it's like, let's cut down the poor people, because poor people can't what? Defend themselves in the court of law. And so I'm saying it's like, it's a poor people issue. Once you get in the poor, it's like class, color, all that kind of stuff. So I just think it's like even though it's not your discipline, I think that you should sure talk about these.
Sure, I can speak to that a little bit. So many people in my field believe it's not a coincidence that our first drug law was against opium in the 1880s. And it's not a coincidence that that was just after the Transcontinental Railroad project was finished with disproportionately Chinese labor. All of a sudden you had an excess labor force. Many believe it's not a coincidence that our first drug laws targeted opium and opium exclusively. Many believe it's not a coincidence in the 1930s that marijuana became illegal, or through the Marijuana Tax Act became de facto criminalized. Many believe was deeply embedded in labor conflicts in the Southwest between primarily Mexican laborers and then white laborers. It's not a coincidence, many believe, that in the 1980s, along with deindustrialization of the American economy, where in the 1950s American cities, you know, if you were the mayor of an American city in 1955, like that's the seat of power. Fast forward to the 1980s, as those jobs went away and manufacturing and industrial jobs went away, many people believe it's not a coincidence that punitive drug laws that disproportionately impacted inner city America came about at those same times. So economic deterministic is a phrase that I read a lot in conjunction with those things. What's interesting is what's going to happen with the current opiate epidemic, and it's really an epidemic. 65,000 drug fatalities a year, half of which related to opiate overdoses, fentanyl and carfentanil. I mean, the debate is being reshaped. San Diego County sheriffs, every single one carries Narcan, 1 dose per person. It has a lifespan, like that's your Pulp Fiction, opiate overdose, bring yourself back to life. Do I have time for one story?
Yeah, good.
I have the pleasure of running a master, everyone's heard the story, I'm saying it again. A master's degree program for law enforcement professionals, probably the most compelling paper I've ever read in my life as an academic came out of this program. It was a 25-year-old San Diego County sheriff who her and her partner pulled up on an overdose in progress in Rancho Santa Fe. And there were 4 young people actively overdosing on opiates. And she pulled up with a partner, and it's rare in San Diego County to have a partner at all. She happened to have a partner that day, and they each rolled up with 1 dose of Narcan each. And there's 4 people actively dying. So it was an ethics paper on who do you save. And, you know, this is a decision that has to be made in seconds. They identified 1 kid they'd seen before who was presumably the dealer, so he's off the table. And so you have 2 doses for 3 people, and what do you do next? And it was just an incredibly compelling analysis. Thankfully, another team showed up in time to save the 3rd person. But it's pretty amazing.
Wait, the teams, they saved the 3rd person, but they left.
No, so here's the math. It's a rarity in San Diego County to have a partner.
Okay.
She pulled up with a partner. The responding backup, the math on this is astronomical, also had a partner. So they had enough to save each person. They saved the dealer last.
Okay.
But, so there's some, I don't know what argument you want to make there, but it's a pretty amazing statistical thing that happened that day. And to read the paper, and because they administered the shot thinking that 2 people are going to die. And, I mean, what an ethics paper.
We've got time for one more question. Oliver, you take it.
So, I think that most people would agree that, like, taking heroin or smoking meth would be considered, like, dumb, right?
And you could die.
Like, put that is hard. And, like, even though, like, a lot of people do it, most people would agree that, like, drinking alcohol is pretty dumb. Like, it's not good for your body, it's a poison. But it's like a willing poison. Like, you actively involve yourself in participating in whatever, and like having fun, enjoying like the mental state that you get to. But like people, the ethical question behind like overdosing on drugs and like going into alcohol poisoning and such, like where's the line drawn between like overreaching into someone's like poor decision making? Like why is it people's jobs to prevent the natural consequences of someone making just a dumb decision? To a degree where you die. Like it's not like, I mean, people like take take heroin, they don't die, like for a long time. Then they, keep upping the dose, and eventually they die because they're willing to just keep going and going and going. You can drink alcohol and not die, just keep going and going and going. So it's almost like, and this is going to be hard to say, but from a kind of utilitarian, kind of emotionally cold perspective, you're kind of interrupting the natural selection of people.
There are some that argue we shouldn't, as a state, invest in things like Narcan, citing that rationale.
You wanted to answer that, didn't you? You look like you wanted to answer Oliver's point. You can have the last word.
I don't think I have an answer for that, but I do, in the short 2 plus a little change years of sociology classes I've been taking, I mean, it reminded me of something Dr. Clack mentioned about how it's kind of arbitrary in a way. I think the beauty of sociology is that it takes into account years and years of history, and from what I've learned so far, and this, my opinion could change, is that I think a lot of what we deem acceptable is arbitrary in our society, and it comes from so many different sources that all collide into one another. And I think, for just one example, in America, I think a huge one is religion, and specifically a very largely dominant religion in America is Christianity. So, I feel like you can take, yeah, I feel like a lot of people think that our laws need to be centered around morals, and they need to pull from a lot of, things that we find to be morally correct, and then, okay, I'm really losing it.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's kind of arbitrary, like alcohol and, meth, really in a different universe, they could be on the same playing field. It really just comes from the history and what we've socialized each other into believing is better or worse. It's the same reason why, you could come in and talk about how you got hammered last night, but you don't want to talk about how you fell flat on your face from meth or whatever. I don't know, it is all kind of arbitrary, but you can't really sum it up with one explanation. It's kind of an accumulation of many different parts of society.
I think that's an excellent way to end.
Yeah.
Thank you
That's
for having the
nice
last one.
job.
Thank you all for being here.